Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Stephanie Creedon, and I'll be your host for today's webinar on how tech companies can build a business continuity plan that actually works. Before I introduce today's presenter, I'd like to go over some housekeeping items. Today's presentation will last about 45 minutes, and we'll then have some time for questions. The slides can be downloaded at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2019. You'll have two options for audio today. You may dial in by phone or listen through your computer. Our audience will be muted during this session, so if you have questions at any point, please send them in to me by using the questions box located on the webinar's control panel. We'll be taking questions at the end of the presentation. I'd now like to introduce Cecilia Farrat. Cecilia is an audit principal at Wolf & Company and a member of our technology services team, where she serves as the software sector leader.
Thank you, Stephanie. I'd like to give a brief overview of the firm and our technology services team. Wolf & Company was established in 1911 and has over a century of experience providing our clients with assurance, tax, business consulting, and risk management services. There are currently over 260 professionals working for the firm at our offices in Boston and Springfield, Massachusetts, Albany, New York, and Livingston, New Jersey. Wolf takes an industry-focused, niche-based approach, and today's presentation is tailored to our technology clients. We specialize by niche so that we can provide our clients with expertise for challenges specific to their organization. With tech companies, these challenges often include accounting and tax matters related to changing revenue recognition models, complex capital structures, share-based compensation, derivatives, research and development tax credits, to name a few. Our technology clients exist across a variety of sectors, including software, clean tech, and fintech. And they also exist across varying stages, from newly founded startups to having recently closed your first round of outside financing, or more mature technology companies that are publicly traded or considering an IPO. So with that, I'd like to hand it off to Tracy Hall to discuss what technology companies can do to build a better BCP.
Thank you very much. And thank you to everybody who is on the call and decided to join us today to talk about business continuity. I know that I'm probably the one who gets the most excited on this call when talking about BCP, so I appreciate that for many of you. Sometimes it can be a daunting task and people really aren't sure where to start and what to include. So that's hopefully what you're going to get out of today's presentation. A little bit about my background. I do have my master level certification in business continuity planning as a master business continuity professional. I've been in the business for over 20 years. My standing joke is that now that I'm in my mid-40s, I'm just going to say 20 years for the rest of my career because it'll help me not to age. I've worked in every industry, including technology companies, financial institutions, healthcare companies, retail, manufacturing, insurance, Wall Street. So you name it, I have written or done BCP work in just about every industry that there is. So what are we going to talk about today? We'll talk a little bit about why business continuity planning is important, some of the current BCP hot topics that you may need to consider and make sure are part of your plan. And then we will have some time at the end of the presentation to go over any questions that the group may have. So why do we do business continuity planning? Obviously in regulated industries, when I get answered this question, it's an easy one because a lot of the people just answer because we have to. But there's a lot behind this as to, why should you have a sound business continuity plan in place? So I wanted to start with, it says a recent survey here, and in fact, it's actually a combination of a few different surveys that I found showing the top causes of downtime. And you'll notice that one of the things I want to point out is I know that the percentages don't necessarily add up to 100. the reason for that being, by what the footnotes suggest, is that several of these different outages may be combined or cross over. So it could be that human error caused a hardware failure. It could be that the hardware failure caused the cyber attack, etc. But I think one of the most interesting statistics on this slide that doesn't really change from year to year is the one at the bottom. So when we talk about planning for the recovery of your business or business continuity or disaster recovery, a lot of people associate that with events such as Hurricane Katrina or Hurricane Sandy. And sometimes what that leads to is people saying, well, we're not in those type of areas, so we're really not susceptible to those type of disasters. And what's interesting is if you look at the slide, those comprise about 4% of the total. I've seen this range from anywhere between 3%, maybe 8%, but it's a very low number. So there are a lot of other things that are causing outages. And outages are statistically location specific, okay? Now with cyber attacks, we do see an increase in the fact that cyber related malicious activity is causing failure of systems, which then rolls into a BCP event. But I hope that this just kind of puts into perspective that it's not really the hurricanes and, you know, the widespread ice type storms. Yes, they happen. Yes, we need to consider them, but that's not the most likely thing that you are vulnerable to. I'm going to speak a little bit to this slide. I don't like talking and reading slides, but this has some really good information within the paragraphs. But just some more statistical information. According to Gartner, the average cost of IT downtime is about $5,600 per minute. And obviously that's across many different companies of different sizes, etc. And I won't bore you with reading the rest of the details. We will have a link to this. As Stephanie said, you'll have accessibility to this recording and to the presentation. But this slide in particular can put a lot into perspective here as to how important it is to cover your business, make sure that you have a plan to cover. And we're going to talk a little bit about what that means, not only to you, but to your customers as well. A couple more statistics here, 93%, and again, these vary from study to study, but they're usually in the low 90s. 93% of businesses that experience downtime of 10 days or more file bankruptcy within 1 year. 40% of businesses severely compromised by a disaster go out of business within 6 months. And again, those vary slightly, but they're usually pretty much in that ballpark. Obviously, if you're down for 10 days or more, you probably don't have a plan in place. So where do we start and what does this process look like? A lot of times people come to me and say, we're very overwhelmed. We don't know where to start. We're not sure what we should include, what we don't need to worry about. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the process. So it typically starts with what we call a business impact analysis, or a BIA. And I apologize if those of you on the call know exactly what I'm talking about, but I'll give a little insight for those of you who don't. So the BIA is the process of prioritizing what needs to be recovered and when following a disaster. It's not just about your business functions, because sometimes I see that there are business impact analyses that document recovery of business functions, right? So it'll have all, 200 business functions listed on a page in order of importance, and maybe a couple of other, criteria about them. But it really needs to be brought down to the level of the resource requirements. So, okay, we know the business functions, but now what needs to be available to support those business functions? How many people and hardware and applications and things like that. What also should happen as part of this process is there should be a gap assessment between when I get hired as a consultant to come in and work with companies to put together their plans. I call it the IT meeting. So I meet with all the business units, get all of their great ideas on what's critical and what's not. and put a big summary together. And then we sit with the IT group for a large working session, sometimes more than one working session. And we go through each and every requirement to determine, is IT prepared to support the business the way the business is expecting it? And in every engagement that I do this, there are always discrepancies. There are always applications that people think are going to be available to them, let's say in 4 hours or 12 hours. And IT will say, you know, we don't really have a plan to recover that for anything less than 24 to 48 hours. So that needs to be communicated to the business so that they can plan for that, or it needs to be communicated to management so that they can plan for additional resources to support the business as adequately as necessary. There's then a risk assessment, which is a location risk assessment. We'll then go through and talk about a variety of different threats. And it shouldn't just be threat types, it should be the individual threats, like how vulnerable are you? What is the probability and impact ratings of this particular threat if it were to occur? You know, how likely is it, and what's the impact to the organization if it happens? And then you go through the plan development based on the results of, okay, what do we have to recover based on the BIA, and what are we most susceptible to based on the risk assessment? And that plan development is always what I refer to as that big 300-page document that has the intro and the scope and the assumptions and teams, information about the recovery strategy, etc. The BIA, I talked about this a lot, but what I wanted to, this is where we start defining some of the timeframes, such as recovery time objectives or RTOs. What that means is, at what point following the outage, what's the recovery time objective that we're shooting for to have this up and running? RPOs, recovery point objectives, or what is the potential for losing the backlog of data based on the backup schedule? This exercise is considered post-outage planning, meaning that at the time that you go down, we no longer care why you went down. We now need to recover, okay? Oops. Risk assessment. So again, probability and impact of the different threats that could occur to the organization. This is an exercise that's considered a pre-planning exercise, and what I mean by that is, we're trying to determine what things could actually impact the business and cause outages so that the company is prepared ahead of time with the appropriate controls, et cetera, and the plans in place to either lessen the probability of this happening or responding in a way that it will lessen the impact to the organization. Scenario-based planning. So a lot of people will say to me, we just don't know where to start and we don't understand how many different scenarios we should be planning for. So what I always recommend is you should document information about responding to a variety of different scenarios within your BCP, and take your risk assessment and maybe come up with, you know, 10 or 12 of the most likely occurrences, and have language in there about, you know, specific details or nuances to, you know, if it's a tornado or earthquake, do you have shelter in place plans? If it's in a regional power outage, what are you doing with your people? Because people can't work from home if there are no generators. But what I ultimately recommend is that you consider the worst case scenario. And the reason being is because if you can plan for the worst case scenario, you can pretty much recover from things that don't match that worst case scenario criteria, right? You want to think about where it will be, you know, what's in scope, what are we talking about as far as the facilities that might be at a loss, and then who is affected. And usually the worst case scenario is going to consider something that has severely impacted your ability to service your customers, but your customers are expecting business as usual. So that brings us back to that statistic I talked about the location-specific outages. In regional type of events, your customers are going to be just as affected, and I'm not sure what everyone's footprint for their customers are geographically on this call. But if they're more localized and they're affected by the same outage, they're going to have a higher tolerance level for your inability to service them. So you want to consider things that are going to ultimately severely impact your ability, but that you have customers that are expecting business as usual. Incorporating multiple scenarios. So usually what I do, here's a question that I'll get a lot. You know, when doing our testing, how do we incorporate the different scenarios in our risk assessment that might cause outages? And what I usually say is, when you're thinking about conducting testing, or even when you're building different components of the plan, you want to think of like 3 different buckets that you want to put your scenarios in. The facilities bucket, the personnel, and the systems. And what I mean by that is, what threats could potentially impact these areas? So many threats. So at the bottom, we've got fire. So fire has the potential to affect the facility, people, and systems. And this should all be noted in your risk assessment so that, sorry about that, I have my IM closed and one just popped up. So the fire has a potential for facility, personnel, and system impact, but other things such as a pandemic event will not have the effect on the facility or systems. It's really just about your personnel. So if you can kind of put these into the buckets, it's also going to help to determine the impact rating within your risk assessment to say, well, how many of these are going to be affected? And literally, I will say to people, put a column that says impact to the organization and maybe have at least these 3. We have a bunch, we have it a lot more expanded, but this will help you to determine if it's just facilities, but the systems are up and we can move people, maybe not as much of an impact as if the facilities are affected that the systems are housed in, right? So now you've got your data center and your facilities down, and maybe because of the nature of what happened, it's a tornado, let's say, you may have a loss of personnel. So personnel recovery, one of the things that I'm seeing a trend shift in is about 10 or 15 years ago, we started seeing a shift towards remote working by personnel, which was working really nicely. You know, people gave equipment and access capability to people that were working remotely. What's happening now is I'm seeing an industry shift within the business continuity planning world of not necessarily shutting this down completely, but not putting all of your eggs in this basket. And the reason being is because of the events of the regional outages, which I know I said were small percentage possibilities, but if they do happen, so there was a study that the SEC did, they did a white paper after Hurricane Sandy, and it was specific to investment advisors, which I know does not fit the group on this call, but if you can get your hands on that white paper by the SEC, you should be able just to Google it, you know, investment advisors, SEC white paper, Hurricane Sandy. There were a lot of great lessons learned, and one of them was the people recovery issue. So they had 40 different investment advisors, and for the most part, they all had a strategy for their people to work from home. However, people didn't have power for sometimes up to 3 weeks after that storm. So they were really in a difficult position because they couldn't even find locations. All the hotels were booked. They were struggling to find places. So what you really want to do is understand how many people within the organization are going to be needed in which timeframes following this event, and where can we put them? Yes, some of them can work from home, but we really need to ensure that we've got space somewhere, whether it be another one of our owned locations, whether it be at a vendor location that offers this particular service, making sure that proper infrastructure is in place. So, you know, if you say, oh, we've got a couple conference rooms at our location and at, you know, in the town of XYZ, well, do those conference rooms have, you know, places for people to plug into for data Is there Wi-Fi? Are there enough power plugs and phone outlets, etc.? So this is becoming a kind of a big topic I'm watching, is around personnel recovery. So it's not just, back in the day, it was mainframe recovery, disaster recovery, just get the systems up and running. And then at some point someone said, or a group of people said, well, that's great. We've got the systems up and running, but we don't have any people to go anywhere to access them. So how do we continue the business? Our people are our biggest asset. So making sure that, you do have a very well thought out plan, that if you need 30 people in a week, where those 30 people are going to go, and that at least a subset of them are going to have access to generated power. Here's another question I get asked often. How many teams do we need to have in our plan? I don't think the number of teams is what's important. I just think it's making sure that you've got a well-rounded bunch of tasks that these people are responsible for. Making sure that there are tasks about the response and escalation period. So, who's assessing the damages, who's communicating and escalating to the appropriate people, authorities, who's making the disaster declaration, making sure that there's a team that's responsible for technology recovery and all of the different areas. With what does that mean? Do we have a network person and a voice person, and who's going to be in charge of making sure the alternate site is up and running? Business unit recovery, ensuring that you've got a plan in place to recover your business units. And that sort of ties in with what I was just talking about with your people recovery. But do they have access to the appropriate technologies, hardware, equipment, etc.? Excuse me. And then the one that I see most forgotten about is restoration activities. It's one thing to have a great plan to move from your primary location to the alternate site, but you need to have a well thought out plan to move back to normal operations. Syncing of data, making sure that the proper equipment, supplies, office equipment, technology equipment, etc., is available and is tested and certified that it can actually support the business when you move back from the alternate location. Communications, if you pull up that SEC white paper report I referenced earlier, this was another one of the big findings, was that a lot of companies had great plans for communicating at the onset of an event, but didn't really have a plan after that. So, what happens to all of these people that are displaced? Where are they getting their updates from? Making sure there are multiple communication vehicles, have a call tree, have an email tree, have conference lines that you can say, okay, every day at 10 a.m. and 2 p.m., excuse me, we need everyone to jump on this call to get updates. Or maybe you have those type of communication bridges set up by department. But making sure that this is planned out ahead of time, so there's an expectation for this, that everyone knows, and you don't have to determine. Obviously, there may be changes if certain communication lines are down or conference bridges are unavailable, but having a plan that everyone sort of expects, so you don't have to determine this at the time of an incident. Communications is going to be your biggest ally for making sure that this goes smoothly. So you have to have a well thought out plan for this. In the technology piece, so this really gets based off the business impact analysis, what the technology group should do. And you'll see throughout this that the BIA is a huge foundation for building a good, solid program. But what I find happens a lot of times is that, the technology groups will have, and you guys are technology companies, so they'll have these great plans for the recovery of systems. But if the business lines that support, your accounting group, your accounts payable and receivable, who handles that within your company? Do you have an HR system because your HR group does this? There are back office groups that are very important that have other systems. And if you don't conduct a full BIA, you may forget about some of those systems that they need access to, even if they're, in the cloud or, hosted by other vendors. you need to still understand that they need connectivity to these systems and whether they have a client that needs to be downloaded or if there are IP restrictions, etc. Making sure that there are the proper infrastructure requirements, adequate hardware and software, bandwidth, personnel. We've talked about a lot of this, but this all goes into, it's not just getting the systems up and running or having a plan to do so. And we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get to the testing portion of this. So outsourcing, I always throw this in here. This is a slide that when we talk about vendor management and vendor due diligence, we also will use a slide similar to this, but I think that this is very appropriate here, especially for technology companies, because I would imagine that there's a piece of your business or pieces of your business that you are outsourcing in some fashion, either for processing or just for technologies that you use that are hosted elsewhere. But what's interesting about technology companies is there are a lot of your customers are outsourcing to you. So you have a responsibility to ensure that you can be available to them even following a disruption of some sort. So we know that when people are relying on vendors, outsource vendors, and in a lot of cases I'm talking about you and seeing this from the perspective of your customers, they want to make sure that you can't easily disappear, and they want to make sure that the data is what they're supposed to be getting and not corrupted, that you're not losing information because your systems are going down and they're not backed up. Do you have the appropriate security measures put in place to not have data security exposure? And are you under delivering, or are you meeting your service level agreements? And one of the most important things you need to do to ensure that you can meet those SLAs is have a plan in place if your systems go down, that they're readily available at an alternate location. Cybersecurity, this is a hot topic every single place that we turn. It's really sort of changing the perspective of business continuity planning, and the way that it intervenes with BCP is because obviously cyber attacks can take down systems, which then cause DR BCP events. The way that this is handled in business continuity planning, I always recommend that you include cyber events not only in the BCP, but as part of your risk assessment. And then you should have an incident response plan that is separate, complete with playbooks on how do we respond to different cyber attacks. That should also be cross-referenced with your BCP to make sure that if there's communication responsibilities, escalation responsibilities, and reporting requirements, that there are not any inconsistencies between your incident response plan and your business continuity plan. And then, of course, incorporating cyber scenarios in your testing, which largely is going to be a tabletop exercise, because you certainly aren't going to, it's going to be too dangerous to actually, do a live cyber event. But usually that's handled as a tabletop exercise. Speaking about testing, so what does testing look like? And it's always recommended to have a testing schedule. A multi-year test plan, if you will. I'm a fan of more frequent dynamic testing instead of trying to do these really robust all-in testing once a year. I think it takes a lot of resources to plan. I think it's very risky to take offline. I know there are people in the industry, and then there are examiners in our regulated industries that may disagree. But my take is that it's risky to try to do a full-blown test. Your test plan should be at least 3 years. I'm not actually a fan of more than 3 years. I think there are too many changes within the technology environment to plan out for multiple years past that. Rotate your technologies and vary the criticality. So, off of your BIA, this should be built off of the BIA. You want to take your critical ones first, right? And plot out. Those need to be done every year or maybe every other year. And then maybe the moderate and lows can be sprinkled in the lows maybe never, because maybe you say, you know what, we don't need to even have those up and running for 4 days or a week after an event. So we can figure that out at the time of the disaster. But the moderates maybe need to be sprinkled in every once in a while. The reason you actually want to do testing is just to ensure that you can support the RTOs that you say you can have things up and running in. So it's very important to make sure that you are performing testing. It's great to have a really great, well-documented, thought-out business continuity or disaster recovery plan. But if you're not testing that it works, the plan cannot be validated. There are many ways to achieve testing. So I always tell my clients, every time you do an evacuation drill, that can be documented as a test. Communication drills, you should be doing communication testing. So testing of your call trees. If you have automatic notification systems, test those systems. Get to the point where you test these without them being announced. Because obviously, if you're announcing a communications drill, there are going to be people sitting by their phone waiting for the call or the text. See what happens if you do it on a Saturday morning unannounced, and see how long it takes people to actually respond. That's where you're going to uncover holes in the plan that you have for communicating and responding. Structured walkthroughs, usually they're done with a smaller group and they get very specific about reviewing individual tasks within the plan. Simulation testing is a very popular thing that we perform on behalf of our clients. Usually you want people that have experience and authority sitting in the room. You want people from every business unit is really what I like to see, including technology. Incorporate a scenario that will test those 3 buckets. So come up with a scenario that does take out a building, does affect your data center, and does affect the availability of some of your people. What's great about simulation testing is that you test decision making in a structured environment minus the chaos. So people have a time to really think through things without being flustered from the stress of the actual event. You can really evaluate different roles and responsibilities by doing it this way and seeing if you've appropriately aligned people with what they're doing in the plan. The other big thing is that it tests the entire timeline of an event. So when you do typical technology testing, it's really just from the time that you declared the disaster. What a simulation test is going to do, though, is it's going to test your tolerance level for declaring that disaster. So how long are we willing to push this before we pull the trigger on activating our business continuity plan and moving to our alternate locations? And then there's the technology test. Some people call it functional test or parallel testing, where you're actually bringing systems up at an alternate location. Obviously, one of the big things that you want to make sure you're doing is incorporating your business lines in this. So have your internal functions, the people who do those internal functions, such as your human resources group or your accounts payable group, have them involved in the technology test so that they can process transactions and ensure that the systems are adequately available from an alternate location. Ongoing maintenance. So it's really important. I can't tell you how many times, I don't know the number, but there are definitely several times that I have been contacted in my career by clients that I wrote a business continuity disaster recovery plan for them. And I use business continuity as the official term now, because it sort of is an overlapping term that encompasses disaster recovery as well. But I can't tell you how many times I've been contacted by clients that I've done work for maybe 5, 6, 7 years ago. We spent, months together putting together this great plan, identifying gaps, assisting them and guiding them through how to fill those gaps. And they call me, 5 years later, and they hunt me down on LinkedIn or whatever and say, Tracy, you know what? Honestly, we did a great job the year after you left keeping this thing up to date, but no one here has time to pay attention to this, and we really need you to come back in. And when we evaluate the state of where the plan is, we identify that very quickly that there's been so much change that sometimes it's easier just to start fresh than try to clean up what we already have. So it's important that with any change within your business, whether it be employee changes, functional changes, technology changes, you move your location, you have different third-party providers, all of that needs to be considered as to how that affects your business continuity plan. Because I can tell you that if you don't spend some time doing this on an annual basis, you're going to be spending a lot of time doing this every so many years. So to wrap this up, we talked about a lot of different things, a lot of very just kind of industry hot topics that I'm seeing right now. There's certainly a lot more we can talk about when it comes to business continuity planning. But it's important to remember, and I think I just said this in the last slide or two, that it involves more than just technology. So one of the big things is that the business continuity plan really needs to be driven by the business, not by technology. So technology, as technology companies, the technology group can own this, but the BIA really needs to be driven by the supporting business. And obviously what you do to provide to your customers is going to be huge. But making sure that the business is involved in what needs to be recovered and when. And if you've got, customers, obviously it's going to be the systems that your customers are looking to be available. But you also need to worry about the other aspects of your business that keep your business running and keep you afloat. People requirements is a big thing. We talked about that. Just don't assume that everyone is going to be available to work from home. In widespread regional events, not only do you have power outages, but sometimes if it's a hurricane, you've got flooding concerns. People are evacuated. I have clients that are actually out in California. One of their big things is, the wildfires. So you can't always assume that people's homes are going to be available as backup locations. What non-technology related resources do you need? Supplies, forms, token requirements, etc. And then how do your third parties play in this? What do you need from them? What should you be looking for from them during your vendor due diligence to make sure that they have an adequate plan in place to give you what you might be passing through to your customers? Outages are caused by a variety of different threats. They're probably not the ones that first come to our mind. It's not going to be that widespread hurricane or, tornado, although, I live in Connecticut, so tornadoes are even much more prevalent than they were back when I started this business. But keep in mind that it's usually location specific. And then the big thing is to make sure that you understand that planning does not stop once you've created your plan. You have to keep this up to date. And the longer it takes you to maintain it, the longer you go without making changes, the more effort that is going to be involved when you really do decide that you have to go back and take a look at it. So at this point, it looks like we're about 40 minutes in. I think we can open this up to some questions. Stephanie, I'll ask you to let me know if there have been any questions that have come up.
Great. Tracy, we did get a few questions. The first is, how long does it take to implement a BCP?
That's a great question. It obviously relies on several factors. Number one is the size of the organization, how many business lines are involved, and how many technologies are included in the scope of the project. I would say 3 to 6 months is a very good average. There are some companies that I've worked for that are fairly large companies where it's closer to 9 to 12 months. So we would scope that out with the company, and even if they were to come, and consult with us on how long should they project if they're doing it internally. It also is going to be dependent on the resources that are required internally, externally to do the project. So a lot of times the struggle internally is that when people get tasked with this, they also have full-time jobs. So this tends to be something that gets put by the wayside. So hopefully that helped answer. It's not a concrete answer, but hopefully that gives you some insight as to how we determine that.
Thanks, Tracy. Another question we received, what's the easiest way to break it up into different phases if a company does not want to do it all at once?
Another great question, and we actually do this with a lot of the proposals that we give to our clients, and sometimes it's because of budget reasons. So typically I would say, well, you always want to start with your business impact analysis. Your business impact analysis and then your risk assessment are going to help you to understand what it is that you need to plan for. So I would say start with your BIA, get a good understanding of what it looks like, you know, from a system and a people and equipment perspective that needs to be recovered. And then if you have to break that up and create your plan at a later date, at least you've done the groundwork. And as long as there isn't much time that goes by between the two, and what I mean by that is if you do a business impact analysis and then go to create your plan 2 years later, I can guarantee that the results of your BIA would be different because that should be updated on an annual basis.
Thanks, Tracy. And another question just came in. What's the best way to get started?
That's a great question too. So, you know, again, this depends on the organization itself. Number one, having buy-in from the top. So some companies recognize this and it's part of their company culture that they have a need for this. A lot of times this is driven by the fact that your customers are asking you for your BCP or a summary of your BCP. So you're sort of put in a we don't have a choice position. And then you also have to decide, are we going to tackle this internally or are we going to outsource this to, you know, a vendor that can come in and do this for us or help us do this. But I think number one, getting the buy-in from the top, making sure that everyone is on the same page as to why this has to be done and why it's important, which speaks to the slides that we started with. Because if you don't have that, there tends to be resistance throughout the process. And then if to start your BIA, it's determining, all right, how many functional business lines in addition to technology do we need to include in this project? And then it sort of kind of goes from there. But that would be the place that I would start, is buy-in, determining, do we have the resources to move this through 3 to 6 to 9 months, however long, you know, based on the size of who's going to, you know, be the, hold the torch, if you will, and be the business continuity coordinator. And then, okay, how many business lines do we need to interview and understand from a business requirements perspective to understand how long that BIA is going to take us.
Thanks so much, Tracy. We don't have any further questions, but if anybody does think of anything after the conclusion of this webinar, please feel free to follow up with Tracy directly. Her information is provided on the slide in the slide deck. And as a reminder, copies of today's presentations are available today at www.wolfandco.com/webinars/2019, and I will also be posting a recording of this presentation to the same web address later on today. Immediately following the conclusion of this webinar, you'll have the opportunity to complete a survey. As always, we appreciate your feedback so that we can continue to improve our webinar program. Thanks so much for attending today, and we look forward to your participation in future webinars. Have a great afternoon, everyone.